Welcome to Where Secrets Go to Die, the disappearance of Derrick Henagan. From the Detroit Free Press, I'm John Wisely. So it's clear now that the Michigan State Police did eventually classify Derrick Henagan as the victim of a homicide. It took almost 7 years to do it, but they got there. And they even looked into the possibility that one of their own, Trooper David Mogenberg, had some connection to it. They did it belatedly, after Mogenberg was dead, and they did it without drawing much attention to it, but they did it. I asked Captain Clint Michelin about it. Again, he ran the state police in the Upper Peninsula when I asked about this case.
And there was this whole Mogenberg thing where, he dies and then 3 weeks later they decide that it is a homicide. Can you speak to why that took that long and why that change was made then?
I can't confidently with detailed facts as to what made that transition or why his name was brought up in that. I don't know if, like in these small towns, if it was a rumor mill type thing or a conspiracy theory type thing, or if there's something substantial to point it in that direction. Even on hearsay type things, just to be prudent, we'll often look into it.
Now, with all due respect to Captain Michelin, I think there's a lot more here than small-town rumor mills. You've got Trooper David Mogenberg's walk in the woods with his daughter, the concerns of his ex-wives, hundreds of pages of internal affairs reports. You've also got personal protection orders, reports that he was exploiting young women, and a boast that Diana had him in her back pocket. The Michigan State Police thought it was worth sending cadaver dogs over to Mogenberg's home to look for Derrick's remains. And I've got to say, of all the things I learned while reporting this story, that one shocked me the most. I've covered a lot of police in my day, but I've never heard of that before. A couple of longtime cops I know were equally stunned. Usually, when a cop dies young, it's all bouquets and bagpipes, not cadaver dogs in his backyard. That search was different from others that appear in the case file. Most have explanations, or at least follow from leads police documented. But this search seems to come out of the blue. There are no notes in the reports that I've seen explaining why Mogenberg's property was chosen. There's no mention of Megan Mogenberg's walk in the woods. The only reference to that appears in a stalking case against Mogenberg. So I asked Captain Michelin more directly.
Is there belief within the Michigan State Police that he was involved?
Yeah, I don't know, based on the investigative findings of the initial information given to our investigators, it might be one of those situations where, this was kind of put out there and they looked into it to some degree, but they didn't have enough tangible things or viable things to comfortably say, okay, let's list them as a suspect in the report, but they wanted to be prudent with their due diligence to follow up on some of these things is kind of what I'm thinking.
One of Mogenberg's former bosses also seemed to think that investigators were simply doing their due diligence. Lieutenant David Hopper was commander of the Newberry Post for several years when Mogenberg worked there. He was listed as being on that 9-person conference call shortly after Mogenberg's death. That's when they decided to reclassify the case as a homicide and send cadaver dogs to search Mogenberg's property. Hopper retired in 2016, but he still lives in town. I figured it was worth seeing if he'd talk to me. He agreed, and we caught up with him at a local restaurant after a Kiwanis Club meeting. I asked him why the case was changed to a homicide and dogs were sent to search Mogenberg's property.
I don't know. I guess I would think it was to certainly cover those suspicions, those accusations, and make sure that nothing was missed in that regard.
He said he had no memory of the conference call or the reasoning behind the search of Mogenberg's place. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything that made him think Mogenberg was capable of being involved in something criminal.
No, I mean, there's not much more I can say. No, I never suspected that. David was one of my troopers. I never would have suspected or believed, still don't believe that.
He acknowledged that Mogenberg was investigated for domestic violence, but said he was well regarded within the state police.
You know, he ended up on the governor's detail. The governor was at his funeral. Highly respected.
So beyond the Mogenberg connection, what else did the state police do to investigate Derrick's case? Turns out, quite a bit, actually. Let's have a closer look at what they did, what they didn't do, the people they honed in on, and what became of it all. According to Diana Maddox, she last saw Derrick on the morning of Monday, August 4th, 2008. But she didn't report him missing until 3 days later. When Diana did file the missing person report, a cop took it over the phone. He noted that Diana said she was worried about Derrick because he was acting depressed. She said he'd mentioned suicide repeatedly. Later on, in a recorded call with Jody Newman, the bounty hunter, Diana described her initial reaction to Derrick's disappearance.
People have no idea what I went through.
Wow.
Heads up, you'll hear a couple of beeps in there. Jody tells me that's a call waiting tone from her phone.
I mean, just the crying and the stress alone, wow. When I look back at it. I laid on my floor for 2 weeks looking for Derrick, thinking it was a joke. Riding the four-wheeler around, looking, screaming, calling, doing this, doing that, thinking, you've got to be... I really thought I was left pregnant. I would have never thought this. This was not even a thought. I thought he was being stupid. And people say, why didn't you report it right away? Think that, really? You know, the first thing, you're a pregnant person, 3 months pregnant, all of a sudden your boyfriend takes off and he's always threatening. You think he got murdered? No, you think the jackass, because he's always playing these games with you, took off.
Right.
That's why I called down. Is Derrick down there? Have you seen him? And then they kept saying, no, I didn't believe him. Really? I called his uncles out in, North Carolina. I called everywhere.
Wow.
Called Cherry. I did a lot. So finally I gave.
Yeah.
And I still did not believe this.
I never found any record showing Diana told the cops about Derrick feeling threatened by other people, as you heard her daughter Megan discuss in episode 3.
And he's whispering, so scared, whispering, "Dad, you gotta come get me. These people are gonna kill me."
That might have changed their approach to this whole thing. As best I can tell, cops were likely thinking Derrick was on the lam. They listed him as voluntarily missing on the initial report. He had those active arrest warrants when he disappeared, and it wasn't too long before they asked a fugitive team for help finding him. One thing they didn't do when he was reported missing? Search the house that Derrick and Diana shared. That always bothered Tom Strand, Betty Henagan's longtime boyfriend.
I mean, if you lose something, if you lose your car keys, don't you kind of think of the last place you might have been and had them, that'd be the first place you'd look?
Now, at Diana's request, police did send a canine the day after the missing person report was filed to check the woods near her home. Those are the woods that Derrick was said to have walked into when he left the neighbor's house down the road. Police searched those woods for more than 2 hours, but they didn't find anything. Police also interviewed, by phone, that neighbor down the road, Denny Murdoch. Derrick had crashed at his place for a couple of nights before he disappeared. The initial report includes no mention from either Denny or Diana of a plan for Diana to meet Derrick at the deer blinds. Over the next several weeks, there are other notes in the file, though. One says Trooper David Mogenberg called Derrick's father, but that line ends with 3 words, no new info. Derrick's mom, Betty Henagan, called police and mentioned that she heard Derrick was supposed to meet Diana at a deer blind. That's the first mention in the report of that planned meeting. That call would mark the beginning of Betty's efforts to push police. She wanted answers about what happened to her son.
I know Betty would make almost daily calls. Then finally they would keep brushing her off enough that maybe went to weekly, but she always checked in. She probably drove them nuts, calling the detectives and stuff.
About 3 weeks after Derrick disappeared, the state police also spoke to Diana again. The police report showed this interview was more extensive. Diana described Derrick's drug problems, and she said again that Derrick seemed suicidal. She also said she talked to Derrick on the phone in the afternoon on the day he disappeared. She said Derrick told her he had to get out of Denny's house. She told police for the first time about the plan to see Derrick at the deer blinds. She said she did look for him, but she never found him. The police also went back and talked to the neighbor, Denny Murdoch, again, this time at his home, where Derrick had stayed. Denny had his own rap sheet, which included a felony, and later admitted to not wanting police around. Police noted in this interview, Denny said he overheard Derrick on the phone with Diana discussing a meetup at the deer blinds. That's the first time police logged Denny mentioning that. Denny also seemed to throw some shade on Diana. He said Diana called looking for Derrick a couple hours after Derrick walked into the woods. Denny said he told her, quote, "You know he's not here. You were supposed to meet him at the deer blind," end quote. Denny said Diana replied, "Oh, was I? I'll go look and see if he's there." As I said, it appears the police still considered this a missing person, and they were pursuing the idea that Derrick was on the run. But they were asking more questions of both Diana and Denny. I mentioned before that I've tried to get Diana to talk to me. I reached out to Denny several times as well, including through email, regular mail, a couple of phone numbers. I went to the most recent address I could find for him. I was never able to connect. Police interviewed a couple of other guys who hung out at Denny's too, including a man named Keith Avery. Keith was 20 then. He'd been living in Denny's basement at the time. He told the cops that on the day Derrick disappeared, Denny asked him to take some of Derrick's things to Diana's place down the road. As best as I can tell, Keith would have made that delivery after Derrick left. Keith said he rode a quad to deliver what he described as a black suitcase, maybe leather, containing Derrick's clothes and some shoes. He left it by Diana's house. I should note, Denny told police that he was Keith's guardian because, he said, Keith was mentally challenged. Others I've talked to have described Keith in a similar way. I wasn't able to reach Keith to confirm that, but I did find his father, Floyd Avery, who rejected that idea. He said he didn't consider Keith mentally challenged, noting he graduated from high school. Floyd did say that his son has battled drug problems for years.
You know, growing up as a boy, he was okay, and when he turned 15, he went to the bad side and started doing drugs and everything, and me and his real mom threw him out, and he ended up going and staying with my cousins down the road, and he just got into a bad group.
Keith is an important piece of this story, which I'll spell out in a minute here. The police chased other leads, too. They interviewed a guy who owned a tattoo shop in Newberry, another who'd seen Derrick riding a four-wheeler with a friend. At the end of August, Trooper Mogenberg was investigating that stolen guns complaint Diana had filed. He checked out a tip that Derrick had been spotted at the house he'd shared with Diana. He and another trooper searched the house with the landlord's permission. He summed up his findings in a single word: empty. A little over a month after that, state police chased tips that Derrick's body could have been dumped in a lake. Betty Henagan had an outside cadaver dog team search 3 lakes and some junkyards. State police noted those yielded nil results. So by December 2008, this is about 4 months after Derrick disappeared, state police had conducted multiple interviews with the people who saw Derrick last. Their next step: polygraphs. Diana, Denny, and Keith all agreed to take them. Diana scheduled hers for January because she was pregnant and about to give birth. On January 20th, 2009, as the nation watched Barack Obama be sworn in as president, Diana Maddox was heading to the State Police Crime Lab in Lansing to take a polygraph. Here's Diana discussing it with Jody Newman.
Even the lie detector test, they gave me a whole paper that said, if you sign this, you realize that you can be held for not only the disappearance, but the murder, blah, 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 of Derrick Henagan. You do not have to do this. You're not in here with an attorney. And like I looked at my daughter, I said, how many people you could just pull off the street and say, sign that and take that test? You don't know this guy, you'll pass. But if you fail, you're going to prison.
Wow.
I walked in there. You know what? I don't care anymore. Give me it. If that's what it takes to shut these people up, because it's driving me nuts. It's eating me alive.
We'll be back after the break. And we're back. A note in the file, dated February 10th, 2009, reads that according to one investigator, quote, Maddox passed her polygraph, end quote. Now, we should note that polygraph test results are typically not admissible in court. Cops use them, but mostly as an investigative tool. Some prosecutors will offer to clear you as a suspect if you pass one. Now, Denny and Keith, they both backed out of taking those polygraph tests. Denny told one cop he would file a harassment complaint if he continued to contact him. In March 2009, police labeled the case inactive. In May 2009, the body hunter, Mike Niger, searched the home Derrick and Diana shared. As I mentioned before, he was accompanied by a human remains detection dog named Tucker. Tucker hit on several spots in the master bedroom, indicating the possible presence of human remains. But the state police didn't seem interested in that.
I'm concerned about the ambivalence towards the place, the residence where Derrick lived, and whether or not that was properly examined for evidence of foul play and of what potentially happened to Derrick. They wouldn't put an evidence tech in there. They wouldn't let the crime lab come in there.
Mike later told me in an email that he eventually came to the conclusion that, quote, MSP really had no interest in getting to the bottom of what happened to Derrick, despite all indications that foul play may have occurred on the property, end quote. Around the time that Mike searched that house, it looks like the police were more focused on the guys down the road, Denny and Keith. As far as I could tell, they didn't search Denny's place, but they did talk to a local couple who had lots to say about Keith. They said Keith had told them many stories about this. One of them said he got drunk, became upset, and started rambling about being a suspect in a missing person case, and said Derrick overdosed. The other told police that Keith said he may have helped dispose of the body. Quote, Keith told him that they took Derrick's body out into the swamp and used some rope to tie him up against a tree in a sitting position, with his arms down to make it look like he sat down against the tree and died. In another telling of the story, when Keith returned to Denny's house, Derrick was gone. Denny came home all sweaty and out of breath and told Keith he had to take care of something. Keith's accounts were initially written off as the liquor talking. And at one point, He said that he wasn't worried because it wasn't a murder case, it was a homicide case. It had to be explained to him that those are the same thing. A detective on the case signed off for Mike Niger, the body hunter, to search the swamp. Niger ultimately conducted 3 searches there, including one with a dog. He did find some bones. A forensic expert at Michigan State University concluded they were deer bones. Still, the prosecutor at the time took the couple's claims seriously enough to issue investigative subpoenas. He wanted them and Keith to testify under oath. About a year after Derrick disappeared, Keith did testify about those conversations. A few weeks later, he took a state police polygraph test. The results are redacted, but a police report noted, quote, he thinks he failed the polygraph because he lied about seeing Henagan on the day he disappeared, end quote. 5 months later, the couple testified. The prosecutor charged Keith Avery with perjury, saying his testimony was contradicted by the couple and that Keith was the liar. As part of his bond, he was ordered to have no contact with Denny Murdoch. While he was in jail, police interviewed him again. He still insisted he didn't know what happened to Derrick. He called the couple pathological liars. He said he believed he may have been set up when he was asked by Denny to deliver Derrick's things back to Diana's house. To settle his case, Keith pleaded guilty to attempted perjury. He ended up paying a fine and getting 97 days in jail, which he'd already served. So what can we make of all that? Could there be something there? Could Derrick have overdosed at Denny's and someone hid the body to avoid being caught with drugs? Could something else have happened down at Denny's? At one point, Denny said police could search his house, but I've seen nothing in the reports to show that they ever did. Why not? Could something have happened to Derrick somewhere else entirely? Maybe. It's possible. But if that happened, what are we to make of the bleach on the carpet? And the damage to the drywall? And what about the blood on the garage floor that Diana's sister reported seeing? Why did the human remains detection dog seem to indicate that there were remains in that house? Could there be a benign explanation for all of that? I struggle with it. I really do. The cops chased other leads as well. They subpoenaed phone records. They got copies of Derrick's dental records. They collected a DNA sample from Derrick's mom to match to any remains they may find. Beginning in 2010, they spent quite a bit of time eyeing a man named Kenny Stebleton, who sometimes hung out at Denny Murdoch's place working on cars. Police chased a tip that Derrick was buried behind Kenny's place, perhaps wrapped in a carpet. Kenny still lives in the area. He's 70 now, and he agreed to a phone interview.
Kenny Stebleton? This is Ken Stebleton. John Wisely, Ken. This is a recorded line, so it's a different number. So
Kenny said he met Derrick a few times at Denny's house.
I knew very little about him other than the fact I think I told you that he came into Denny's driveway. I had a 2007 Toyota truck, brand new, and I had it parked outside the garage where I was working on a pickup truck for my grandson. And he'd about started spinning around on one of the hot rod quads, throwing rocks all over everything, including my truck. So I was a little irritated about that and went out and said something to him, and he left. And I only saw him maybe 1 or 2 times after that before he came up missing or whatever happened to him.
Kenny insisted he doesn't know anything about Derrick being buried behind his property, a theory he said he first heard from Keith Avery.
He's probably the one that started the comment about, the next thing you know, they're going to blame you, and then they're going to say that you buried him out back in your swamp. And I'm like, Keith, don't say stuff like that. And then it wasn't a couple of days later, I started hearing in Newberry a bunch of crap about it, just like that.
Kenny insisted he doesn't know what happened to Derrick. In February 2011, the county prosecutor subpoenaed Denny, Kenny, and Diana to testify under oath as part of the investigation. The reports say all three testified consistent with their earlier interviews. All three denied any involvement in Derrick's disappearance. Still, the prosecutor was willing to offer Kenny immunity if he told them where to find Derrick's body.
I told him at the time, before he even did the deposition, that I couldn't tell him where the body was because I had no idea. I had no idea what happened to the young man. To this day, nobody even knows where he is, or if he's deceased, or if he's still alive.
Police also searched Kenny's home on an unrelated case, but clearly had Derrick in mind when they did it. They found a computer. They got a search warrant to examine its contents for, quote, any and all records or documents located on the computer pertaining to the disappearance or death of Derrick Henagan, end quote. I've seen nothing in the records I've received that show anything came from that computer. Kenny said he never got it back. Kenny said the search of his house was one of 3 times the state police kicked in his doors. He said it was part of a pattern of harassment directed at him after Derrick disappeared.
There's a saying that goes around up here. It says, arrive in Luce County on vacation and leave on probation.
I've never heard that one.
Well, you have now.
The investigation was far from over, but it was one in a series of openings and closings, moving it from active to inactive. Jody Newman, the bounty hunter, she watched the way it was handled.
How many Michigan State police investigators have worked this case as far as you know?
Let me see. We had Sergeant Detective Shire, Sergeant Detective Bill Smith, Sergeant Detective Richard Rule.
And that's the way the case was. It was passed around among several investigators.
We've had Trooper Wilson, Trooper Mogenberg, and Trooper Grenfell. And there's some other ones.
Mike Niger worked 25 years for the state police before retiring. These days, he keeps busy with his own search and rescue group. He said that's not really unusual.
They retire, they get promoted, or they transfer. And so there's been several detectives on the case.
The investigation also included several of the people you've already heard about. Heather Aldrich was one of them. Remember, she was later murdered. And Heather was the one who told friends that Trooper Mogenberg raped her. Police interviewed her 3 times during the Henagan investigation. At the time of one interview, she was in jail and looking to be released. She offered police that tip that Derrick was buried behind Kenny's home. Police told her that was common rumor and kept her locked up. Police also got a tip from Keith Avery. He said he heard it in a jail cell from Jody Hutchinson, who would later be murdered alongside Heather Aldrich and Carrie Nelson. Jody said that a guy named Bum had handled one of Diana's missing guns, and Keith believed the guns were buried with Derrick's body. Police deemed it not credible. And so it went. A tip here, a polygraph there, a subpoenaed record. But by 2015, Trooper Nathan Grenfell was working the case. He was not a detective, but he was assigned to the case, and he worked it pretty hard. I reached out to him, but he declined my request for an interview. Jody Newman, the bounty hunter, who's followed this case closer than anyone, was impressed with Grenfell's work.
The only consistent presence that was ever on this case is Trooper Grenfell. Had they allowed him the leeway, Trooper Grenfell could have solved this case. That's my personal opinion. He could have solved it. He had the drive to solve it.
This is a 2-part episode. Part B, The Axe in the Wall, is already in your queue. Coming next.
You've told the whole story to me with facial expressions, emotions. I've been watching your eye twitch. God.